There we go. So we're recording. So anything that has jumped out at you over the week, anything from last week's class that that gave you some reflection, you wanted to follow up on, or you wanted to ask a question about, just wanted to open that up. Anybody? Just if so, unmute yourself and ask your question.
Darryl, this is Sherry.
Hi, Sherry.
I'm just, chapter 4 is really full of a lot of parables.
Yeah.
I guess I throughout my life, I've always heard them and tried to see them being interpreted. But my question is, why did Jesus always speak in sometimes complex parables for us to search so hard to find out what he meant?
Yeah, what a great question, Sherry. Thank you for asking that. Yeah, I was gonna dive into the parables a little bit in the second half of our class today, but we'll do it now since you're asking the question. No, it's a great, I'm glad you did. So, one of the things to know about the parables is sometimes people think that Jesus invented parables, and that is not the case. Jesus, being a good Jewish boy, would have grown up learning about many of the great rabbis of Jewish lore that also taught in parables, and that searching for meaning is a deeply Jewish tradition that it really does inform the Christian faith. It's that idea of wrestling with the text and wrestling with the story that we glean meaning from. And one of the things that I would hope that all of you would take away with you from the idea of a parable is there is no such thing as one meaning to a parable. Even in the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus actually takes a moment and explains the parable of the sower to his disciples, is not the only meaning of the parable of the sower. Now you might say, well, Jesus said that that's what the meaning is. That's what Jesus said the meaning was right then. But if we caught Jesus a year later talking about the parable of the sower again with his disciples, depending on where Jesus and his disciples were in their point in their life, Jesus might have had a completely different meaning. So like a good poem, like a good metaphor, like the story, like, as a Gen Xers, like watching Star Wars. Every time you watch Star Wars, you get another meaning for what the Force truly is. It's kind of the same thing with the parables. Depending on where you are in your life and where God is in your life, you will by inspired by the Spirit glean different meanings from it. That's really the power and the blessing of a parable. It's confounding for a reason. It's meant to help us touch our hearts and our minds. That's my shorthand. Does anyone else have a thought about parables? Jump right in and share. Or Sherry, you want to say, how does that sound to you?
Oh, it makes perfect sense now. I guess I just didn't think deep enough to understand that was my deepened learning of his parable. And as many times as I've read several of them over and over again, it is very true that something else will pop up to me that I didn't realize what it meant, like maybe 20 years ago when I heard the same parable. So it's just that's why I love Bible studies, because it's just continual learning and re-experiencing Jesus's word. So thank you.
Right. Yeah, you're very welcome. Like, I'll just give you an example. One of the times that I've been reading and I come across the mustard seed parable, where I was in my life at that moment was I felt really small. I felt really helpless. I felt really insignificant. And I read the parable of the sower, and I had a very individualistic kind of, I gleaned a very individualistic meaning from it, that God could use even me, someone who was feeling so small and insignificant, to do good things. That's just that one time that I read the parable of the mustard seed. Then as a pastor of the church, 10, 15 years later, I read the parable of the mustard seed, and immediately my mind goes to, oh my gosh, Jesus is talking about an ecosystem of community, that the church is really the mustard seed, and it's about creating an ecosystem where different quote unquote birds can flock to and flourish and grow and get what they need, so then they can go off and do their birdly things, you know. And I had a completely different understanding of the mustard seed. It's about community, and it's about nourishing the quote unquote birds that come into your community, and it's about an ecosystem that shares its resources with each other and provides respite and shade and nourishment for those. Those are two completely different meanings from the exact same parable. And it's where I was in my life and where God was in my life that I had those two completely different reactions and meanings to the exact same parable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, just following it up, because as we read the interpretation that Mark is giving to that parable, I think we also get insight into some of the circumstances that were happening at his time in the area that were very important, probably somewhat political as well as religious significance, and we I think we're enriched by the variety of interpretation that he gives us, particularly when we relate it to some of the events of that day,
Right.
Under Roman occupation. So I think it's just the same thing that we do with because I do the same thing you do. As I read my Bible, I read my Bible in the context of where I live, and I think Mark did the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure, for sure. And if we follow the tradition that says that Mark was getting this from Peter, this could be, you know, the way that Peter is interpreting it for Mark, right? And so there's a lot of different things that are going on. This is one reason why I always say that Bible study is best done in group and in conversation with one another. And the parables are probably the very best way, or the very best teachings of Jesus to do in group, because you might be in a completely different place in your life than I am, and by you sharing what you get from the parable, it inspires and enlightens me and helps me understand it a little bit better, and vice versa. All of you, beware of anyone who says this is what the parable means, without qualifying it for today. This is what it means today, because the very next time that you encounter it, you might have a different meaning. And by the way, Kelly, I see your hand real quick. By the way,
oh yeah,
the same could be said for the crucifixion, for the resurrection, for so many other stories that we read in the gospel. The crucifixion has hit me in a lot of different ways, from personal tragedy and deaths to lynchings and political killings. Like it has meant a lot of different things to me. Go ahead, Kelly.
Well, I was just going to make a comment that a few years ago, when I really started reading the Bible more intensely with a friend, what I realized is, in my thinking, I'm very black and white. So I would read something and I would take the word to be very literal. And I think what the parables, to your point, and not just in the parables, but a lot of the words of the Bible doesn't mean exactly specifically the way that I apply meaning to a particular word. So it got me really thinking on different dimensions, just, to your point of what you were explaining with your interpretation of parable differences.
The only thing I would also add, and I think I said this, but I just want to reiterate it just a little bit deeper. A parable is not only to elicit an intellectual response. It really is meant to also elicit an emotional and spiritual response here, as much as it is supposed to. And I am, when I get into Bible study and I can geek out over stuff, I can get really up here when I'm doing Bible study. So it's really important for me to also think about what is communicating, how the parable is communicating to my heart and to my spirit as much, because I am such a nerd, I can really get into just sort of the weeds, right? And so so that's one reason why it's always good. Some of y'all always kind of pull me out of that, right? I'm like, oh, right. No, thank you so much. And I always like that slight correction from y'all because again, I can get stuck up here pretty easily. But let's move into, that's a great question. Any other?
I'm going to play the educator card. Those that know me, not going to surprise at this. Jesus is a teacher, and this is what he's doing as teaching. And I think anybody that tries to teach somebody, we can always tell people what to do and how to learn. But if we can help them a way to figure it out for themselves that benefits them, that's real teaching. And I think that's, when I think about Jesus being a teacher, I always think of that course. That's my educational background speaking too.
Yeah, that's good pedagogy, right, Mike?
Yeah.
That's what that is. That's good pedagogy. And it's not in just what he says. He's also teaching by the way the examples that he's setting. Here soon he'll send them out on their own to do things, right? So they can make mistakes and learn from their own mistakes. That's there's different levels or different ways to get the learner to kind of take it on for themselves. Yeah, hang on, let me admit one new person. Okay, so we're going to jump into Mark 3. I don't think we got a chance to really discuss this much, but one of the important things that I'm always trying to remind people of is the fact that Jesus was a good Jewish boy who grew up with a good understanding of Jewish principles and morals and ethics underneath him. And so much of what Jesus is doing in his ministry, his teaching, and his example that he's setting is he's taking what he experienced as a child and what he grew up in, and he is expanding it. And nowhere, and we get a really good example of how immersed and how knowledgeable he is of Jewish moral and ethical teachings than what we get in Mark 3, 1-6, which is the example of healing of a person on the Sabbath, the man who has the withered hand. And he asked this very profound question to the people in the synagogue that day, particularly the synagogue leaders, the Pharisees. He asked this question: is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill? And he doesn't get a response from according to the story, he doesn't get a response from the Jewish leadership, from the Pharisees in the synagogue that day. And that angers him, that frustrates him to no end. I love this scripture verse, is that he looked around at them in anger, frustration. They should know better than this. So this, and notice this man doesn't ask to be healed. Jesus does this by being moved by compassion himself. He doesn't wait for the person to ask to be healed. And sometimes he does. Other stories we get to in the Gospel of Mark, people will say, heal me, or you can heal me. But Jesus in this case doesn't wait for someone to ask. He just is moved by compassion for him. And Jesus has a very clear understanding. And I think this is a really good lesson for us in beloved community and Christian community, that our customs and traditions are all well and good, but ultimately the preservation and the healing of human life overrides everything else that we are doing. And we can be stopped in our tracks with our own traditions and customs when we are confronted with the opportunity to be moved by compassion to bring someone and restore them to the fullness of health and the fullness of their life. Now, you might be asking the question, well, was this man's life really in danger? Why couldn't Jesus just wait one more day to to heal this person. And I would put that back on you and to say, who gets to say what's a life and death situation in terms of this? I would just ask you that question, pondering in your heart, whether or not this man who has been living with this ailment and this malady for so long, what would one more day of that mean to him? And so, because Jesus is calling us into sort of restoration and the changing of our lives and our behaviors, because the kingdom of God is near, he applies this principle called pikash nefesh, which is the Jewish law, the Jewish principle that says there is no law greater than the preservation of human life. And all other commandments and laws in the Jewish Torah, in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, all of the teachings of the great rabbis fall away when there is the need to preserve human life. And so, even though Jesus doesn't say I'm evoking this, this is very clearly what Jesus is talking about. And so I wanted you to be made aware of that. So then afterwards, he calls, after this example of healing this man, which, by the way, the crowds went away amazed. The religious leadership were annoyed with him, but to the point where I think it actually says they looked to destroy him. Is it that this time or the next time? Yes, they look to destroy him. I meant to look up the Greek word there, destroy. I didn't. I wanted to see how harsh that word really was, but I didn't do it. So maybe next time I'll get to it. But after the story of the healing, we get the story of Jesus calling the 12 disciples. Now, if you're paying attention up to this point, Jesus has called 5 disciples. He's called Peter, he's called Andrew, he's called James, he's called John, and he's called Matthew. But he actually never calls them disciples, or he just says, "Come and follow me." What has happened between chapter 1 and chapter 3 is the crowds continue to mount and to grow, and so Jesus in the Gospel of Mark chooses the 12 amongst those who have been kind of hanging out with him in terms of the crowd. These are people that he vets and that he kind of chooses. The way that Mark writes, the way that Mark writes it is he called those whom he wanted, but it's among the crowd that he's already met. Peter and Andrew, John and James are called kind of uniquely, but the other 8 seem to have come to hang out with Jesus after hearing him preach. His popularity grows. So I think that's really interesting. That for me it is that Jesus calls his most closest and trusted companions to out of the crowds that were kind of gathering, which I think speaks well for you and me. That these people were ordinary people who heard what he was talking about and were inspired by him to kind of hang out with him, which are kind of what we all are, right? We're kind of learning more about him, and we're kind of hanging out. We're trying to hang out with him as best we can. And so those who are called, those who hear that calling and receive that, are amongst the 12, or amongst the crowd. And then he appoints 12 of them, which of course corresponds to the 12 tribes of Israel. 12 is a very sacred number among the Jewish people, and Jesus being a good Jew, it's not coincidence that he chose 12 of them to sort of be, his closest companions. Does anyone have a question about that?
Why do you suppose he called Judas Iscariot?
Okay, so there is There's two questions. There's two ways to answer. Well, there's more than two, but there's two for me. One is if you look at it from a providential aspect, that for the passion to occur, Jesus needed to be. Look how bored Willow is with the class. She just went over there and just hung out and just like dropped down at the back. They're just like, this is so boring. So hopefully you're not feeling the same way, but she's not feeling it. So there's the providential side of it, the sort of like divine ordainedness way of looking at it, which is for the passion to occur, someone's going to have to betray him. And Judas actually has a part in that plan, right? That's one of the ways of looking at it, is Jesus calls him because he knows someone's going to have to do this, and it might as well be, and Judas is the one. Another way, I'm not saying that's the way I prescribe to it, but that's one of the ways the tradition has understood why Jesus would call Judas. Another way is Jesus saw something in him. He saw gifts and graces for what Jesus was trying to do, and for whatever reason, Judas felt the need later on to turn him into the authorities and set those events that we call the passion in motion, but maybe wasn't divinely chosen to do that. If you are familiar with the Gnostic Gospel of Judas, it was published, I think, about 7 or 8 years ago. They discovered the Gospel of Judas among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it finally got around to interpreting it. It tells the story that God had a very specific plan for Judas, and that plan was basically to he was strong enough to have all the hatred and scorn and shame of the world kind of put on him as much as it was put on Jesus. I'm not saying that that's an orthodox view. I'm just saying that's what that the writer of that gospel kind of felt it was. So there's a lot of different ways to kind of look at it. I personally kind of feel like Jesus saw something in him and felt that he was the right person for that job. And then of course there's so many great pieces of literature and art and plays and pop culture that have tried to answer that question. Probably none better than Jesus Christ Superstar, but that's my own shorthand. I'm sure other people have their own, but that's my answer to it. I did look up a couple of the other ones. Obviously, the tradition is that Judas hung himself. The tradition is that Peter was executed in Rome around the year 62, 64, or somewhere in there. The only one to have, according to tradition, the only one to have lived a long life and died of natural causes in old age is John. And John died in Ephesus. That's according to the tradition, and was the caretaker of Jesus's mother, Mary, until he died. Thomas is the patron saint of India and is the one who went farthest east. Matthew is thought to have gone down to northern Africa. So, I mean, just to kind of give you a sense of this is what they do after the resurrection, but but we really don't know what happened to them after. We really don't know what happened to them after the gospel stories, other than really Peter is the only one that we really have any sense of the 12 of what happened to them afterwards.
Darryl, I have a
Yeah.
question. This is Carol.
Yeah, Carol.
So Judas didn't start out to be, he supported Jesus at first, correct? So he didn't start out to go after him. And how long was he a disciple before he betrayed him?
So the tradition is that Jesus did a public ministry for about 3 years, Carol.
Okay.
And so, Jesus doesn't call the 12 disciples at the very beginning of his public ministry. So somewhere between 1 to 2 years was Judas. Just doing the math in the gospel, right? Is he was a disciple for 1 to 2 years.
Thank you.
Yeah. He's actually not the one who's called a zealot, by the way. The one who's often referred to as the zealot is Simon. And you should know that being called a zealot in that time was someone akin to someone who was okay with sort of like guerrilla warfare and what we would consider to be kind of like terror activity against Rome. Someone who was willing to kind of do violent military, quasi-military action against the Roman legions. So Simon the Zealot would have had a background in kind of paramilitary operations, but by becoming a disciple of Jesus, would have had to kind of given up those ways. So there's something to be said about that as well.
How did the other disciples act when they found out that Judas betrayed Jesus? How was their behavior? And
well, that's a great question, Carol. I can only tell you what we know from the Gospels, which is none too kindly. All of the ones. So you get this in Mark where he says, from the very beginning, Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him, so we know right away that's going to happen. A little foreshadowing there, or spoiler alert, I should say. It's not even foreshadowing; it's a spoiler. And then it's in the Acts. I think it's in Acts that we have Judas. Is that the one? Gosh, I always have to look these things up. In one gospel, he hangs himself out of shame and guilt for what he did, and the other one he throws himself off a cliff. I can't remember. I always have to look up which one it is. But those are both kind of horrific stories, right?
yes,
One, both of them are suicide due to
shame. Was he
shame, right? It's a shame and guilt.
Shame.
That's kind of like what the impetus is. History has not been kind. When Dante writes his Inferno, Judas is one of the 3 heads of Satan, right? Along with the 2 other great betrayers, Brutus and who betrayed Julius Caesar? Brutus and
Oh gosh, I should know this. I've seen the movie a million times. Pius. Oh,
anyway, I'll sit here all night trying to remember that. You can look it up. That's what Google's for. But Judas obviously has not been, betrayed well. Yes, Kelly.
Just real quick. I was thinking about the question that was asked, why was he selected as a disciple? And I would never put myself on the same level as the 12 disciples, but I have reflected on being called as a disciple, and what would I do if I was really threatened and my life was really, it could go either way. Am I going to hold on to life on this earth? I'm just being real. It's not a stretch for me to think about betraying someone to hold on to my own personal life. And so that the world treated him so harshly or thought of him so harshly after the fact. I don't know. I just kind of internalize on if I were in that situation and it was either I feared for my life because I was a follower of Jesus. When it really comes down to it, if someone says to me, if you're a follower of Jesus, this is going to be the end of your life. Am I going to say out loud, I'm a follower of Jesus? I'm just being real.
Yeah.
There's going to be that moment where I have to choose, am I really in or am I just kind of privately in.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Or no?
No, it does. It does. And I think Kelly, you're also hitting on the farther we've gotten away from the actual event, and the more we've tried to lean into more of the grace and compassion side of Christ, our hearts have changed towards Judas over the years. And I think there's a softening towards him that the tradition has not offered in the past. And I think that sort of personal reflection is one of the reasons why. So I appreciate you sharing that. The other person that we get a lot of in Mark, that people always have a lot of questions about, is Satan. So we get a lot of Satan in Mark. And so I wanted to give you a little bit of background on Satan. So hang on one second. Good old Satan. So off to the right, you have a bronze statue that dates back to about 1200 BCE. It is a bronze idol rendering of the Canaanite god Baal. And if you know your Old Testament, then you know that Baal was the ancient god of the Canaanites, who were the rivals to the Israelites. And the god Baal was the arch enemy of Yahweh, of the God of Israel, in ancient times. And much of the Satan myth that Jesus inherited when he was born, and what the type of Judaism that he grew up in, much of the Satan myth actually can trace its roots to that of the god Baal from ancient Canaanite religion. And so by the time we get to Jesus talking about Beelzebub, which was a common name for Satan in the first century, it is derivative from the name Beelzebub from First Kings. If you read First Kings in the Old Testament, Baal gets referred to as Beelzebub, which we translate into English as Lord of the Flies, which if you've ever read that book, you know why that name of that book sort of applies so well to the events that take place in that novel. And so when Jesus refers to Beelzebub in the first century, you got to remember that, like, Dante's Inferno and Paradise Lost has not been written yet. And I just want to tell y'all that so much of what we think about Satan that we think is in the Bible is not. It's so much of the Satan myth comes from those amazing books of literature, Paradise Lost and Dante's Inferno. But from a biblical standpoint of Satan, Satan has become kind of God's newest adversary, much like the god Baal was in ancient Israel by the time Jesus's ministry begins in the first century. And yes, the ancient Jews, much like their ancestors in ancient Israel, had a very binary sort of understanding of the cosmos: good and evil, dark and light, God and Satan. So much of that is rooted in, in 5th, 6th, 7th, 12th century BCE understanding of who Baal was as much as Satan. But the idea that there were malicious, let's go with that there were malicious spiritual entities trying to derail God's redemptive work was very much part of first century Judaism. And the greatest example of that is Rome. And so when we get to the story about the young person who has a legion of demons in them, so many demons that they were called legion. That is literally the gospel naming the Romans as the personification of the evil in the world. And we get that gets lost on us. But the work of Satan was most appropriated and most personified in the ancient church as the work of the Romans and the Roman occupation. So that kind of gives you a sense of where we are with this. But the idea is, and I got this to the next slide. I forgot to go one more slide over here. But basically what Jesus is saying in Mark 3:20 through 27 is, if I was an instrument of hate, if I was an instrument of darkness, if I was an instrument of evil, then there was no way that I would be able to do the work and the exorcisms that I am able to do and the healings that I'm able to do. And really, Mark 3:20 through 27 is Jesus's way of saying what Martin Luther King later says, which is, there's only one way to drive out darkness, and only light can do that. There's only one way to drive out hate, and only love can do that. That really is what Jesus is saying in a nutshell in this chapter of Mark, and the story of Mark. So what I would encourage you is not to get wrapped up so much in the myth, though I wanted you to kind of know where it comes from, of Satan, as much as recognize Satan as a personification of these malicious forces in our lives and in the world, that prevent us from recognizing the blessing and the beauty and the amazingness of God in our world. And so to be able to kind of push that back, we really must have love kind of in our hearts. So any comments about that? Any thoughts about that before we move on? Is that kind of understood? Because sometimes we can get tripped up by sort of the Satan stuff. And I have found that actually progressive churches have so many questions about Satan. So many questions. So like, that's one reason why I wanted to spend just a smidge of time, because honestly, I almost always get a question about it. Like, where did it come from? Who is this person? Like, what are we talking about? Any questions about that or any comments?
It's a clarification for sure.
Yeah. Thanks, Carol. I appreciate it. How many of y'all grew up going to church where like Satan was actually like mentioned quite often?
I grew up in the Baptist church. I was 19 years old when I went to a Presbyterian church. That was the first time I heard God loves you. And not that I was going to hell.
Wow.
Mhm.
19 years old, huh?
Yep.
All right.
Grew up in the Baptist church, and I didn't really believe everything. Well, first, I didn't think it was wrong to dance, and I just didn't believe all of their theology, so I got away from it.
I'm glad you're dancing. That's always fun.
Not so much anymore.
Yeah. Slower, right? You dance slower. More of the slow songs.
Yep.
Thanks for sharing that. I appreciate you sharing that. Well, of course, I grew up in Texas, so like, even if I wasn't going to church, I heard about Satan all the time. So, but and I was fascinated. Who grew up with like the children's Bible, that old illustrated children's Bible? Oh my gosh, the classic illustrated children's Bible. There is one of the scariest images. I'll have to find it for next time. It's one of the scariest images ever. Jesus being tempted by Jesus on the mountaintop.
Oh,
He is so scary looking. It sticks to me though. Sticks with me to this day. So anyway, any other questions or thoughts about that before we move on? Because the last thing I want to say about chapter 3 here. There we go. The last thing that Jesus kind of ends with in chapter 3 is the expansion of the idea of family. So family is absolutely essential to first century Judaism. It is the atoms and the molecules upon which Jewish society is built upon. And so much of the rites and rituals, the laws, the teachings, the moral understandings of one's responsibilities in the world are defined by your relationship with your family. And a lot of your responsibilities towards justice and compassion and mercy kind of end at the border of your family. Maybe a few concentric circles out beyond your nuclear family, but the power of the nuclear family as the building block of society is essential to the culture that Jesus is growing up in and that his ministry is born out of. And so in this scripture verse in the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus's mom and siblings come to get him because someone has gotten to them and said, there's something wrong with your boy and you need to come and get him and take care of him. They're coming out of not only love for him, but even if they didn't love him, which I totally don't believe that. I totally believe Mary and his siblings loved him. Even if they didn't love him, they would have a responsibility due to Jewish custom and law to take care of him in his ailment. But then but of course, nothing is wrong with Jesus. And when he hears that his mom and his siblings are there, he says, who really are my mother and my siblings? It's those who do my will. It's those who follow me. And I quote, here are my mother and here are my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. So this expansion of family and being family to one another is not just a sentimental statement. It's very nice on the surface, and it's a way for him to communicate his love and his connection to his followers. But by saying that they are family, there are certain rights and responsibilities that come with being family in ancient Judaism. And the three things there at the bottom are the three most pressing. There are others, but these are the three most pressing. If you are family with one another, you have a responsibility to care for the young, the elderly, and the ailing. And caring for means providing for. It means making sure that they are fed, that they are sheltered, that they are clothed, that they are nursed back to health. These are commandments that come straight out of Leviticus and Numbers. They also have a responsibility for caring for the poor members of their family. So if I'm doing pretty well for myself, if I have plenty of food on my table, if I have extra rooms in my house, if I have extra coats and clothes to wear, and I have a member of my family that is going hungry, is unhoused, and does not have enough clothing to wear, then I have a moral responsibility, according to Jewish custom, to not starve myself, not give away all my food, but to give away enough of my food that my family member who has none gets enough.
Darryl,
Yes.
is that a current belief of Judaism? Would you say modern Judaism holds the same tenets?
I would. Yeah, I would.
Okay.
I would. Yes. And they do it just like we do it, Diane, by giving to larger organizations. You know, it's not so primal anymore. In Jesus's day, there were no such things as as Jewish family services or There was, there was no larger organizations that you could funnel money to who was doing this work. It was meant that you were supposed to do the work. You were Jewish Family Services, basically. The community was, at least. So much like we funnel money to agencies and places like Mel Trotter, like Degage, and we might not do it so much personally, but we do it through these trusted mission partners. Jewish folk are doing the exact same thing, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, thanks.
Yeah. And then the last one is education. Education has always been important to the Jewish people. Education was very important to Jesus's time. I do truly believe that Jesus was educated by his father. That is one of the biggest responsibilities for a Jewish father, is to teach his children, particularly in ancient times, his male children, but all of his children need to get somewhat of an education. And so educating the next generation is a huge part of what Jesus's upbringing would have taught him. So by expanding this definition of family, it's not just sentimental, like, oh, we're family. With that sentimentality comes real important rights and responsibilities. And even though there are no Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Mark, when you read the Sermon on the Mount, when you read it from that idea that Jesus is expanding the rights and responsibilities of being family together, the Sermon on the Mount all of a sudden makes so much more sense. And because if you look at it as these are what we do for family, it really does hit even closer to home, without no pun intended. All right, so that's the end of gospel, the third chapter. We didn't get to 4. We only got 5 more minutes. 4 is the parables. And so I think we'll start there. So reread the parables, maybe have a different understanding of them next time you read them. So we'll pick up on March 1 with the 4th and 5th chapters of Mark. But in the last 5 minutes that we have together, anything from today, from the first 3 chapters, even chapter 4, like Sherry, jumped us into the parables, which was great. I'm glad we got to touch on that a little bit. Yeah.
Darryl, one of the things that perked my memory was that a sermon you gave at one time, or something at church, about Joseph and how he's not mentioned very often. And you just mentioned that he would be the one educating Jesus. That would be the role that he would play.
Yeah.
The roles he would play, that Joseph would play.
Right. So the Gospel of Luke is the only gospel in the Bible. There are other gospels outside of the Bible that mention Joseph and Jesus's adolescence, but the only book in the Bible that mentions Jesus' adolescence is the Gospel of Luke. And Jesus is roughly 12 or 13 years of age in that story. And Joseph is still around, right? Joseph is the one that finds him in the temple and says, "Where you been?" And and kind of tells him, to get in the car. So Joseph would have been responsible for Jesus's education in the Torah. Now, in first century Judaism, the education would have been about learning the Torah, right? That's when we say educating them. It's not about mathematics or writing or whatever. Though if you learn the Torah, you're going to learn how to write. But that's the responsibility of the father in ancient Judaism, is to educate the next generation. And it's said a lot of different times, Carol. It's not just said once in the Old Testament. It is said a number of times. And there's a bunch of rabbinical literature as well, talking about how important education is. So to our best guess, Jesus was not illiterate. One, it would have meant that he had a really bad father in Joseph if he was illiterate. Two, there's the story in the synagogue where he actually is handed the scroll and he reads. So so that's another reason why we kind of think that he was literate, that he could read and write. And then lastly, I said this on the first day, I think Jesus grew up, though Nazareth was, from all intents and purposes, from archaeological evidence, a pretty small rural town. He grew up pretty close to a pretty bustling Roman settlement called Sepphoris, and that's would have been more likely that that's where Joseph, as a carpenter, would have gotten work. So if Jesus learned the trade of his father as carpentry, probably by 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, he's going to Sepphoris with Joseph, and he's learning the trade. If he had a typical Jewish upbringing in the first century.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, no worries. That's a great question. Any other comments or questions? Okay.
The disciples, who did they think Jesus was at this point?
Oh my gosh, what a great question. Okay, so we didn't get to chapter 4, but at the end of chapter 4, we have Jesus crossing the lake over to the other side, which is such a great story, and like we'll get to that in 2 weeks. By the end of that story, the disciples say, "Who is this that can even command the waves and the wind?" And so we, at that point, Diane, at this point in the story, through 1/4 of the book, it seems as if the disciples have no idea. they seem clueless at this point, which actually is one of the trademarks of Mark, right? The disciples don't necessarily come across in necessarily a really good light in the Gospel of Mark, but at this point in the story, you got to get a sense that the disciples think that he's a great teacher, a great healer, a great exorcist, definitely someone to follow and to listen to, but they themselves at this point don't seem to have a really good understanding that Jesus is the Son of Man, the Son of God, the Messiah, or anything like that. And I think that's on purpose. I think Mark wants them to go on that journey of discovery and in faith, just like we all go on that same journey. That seems to be important to Mark, that we get to go on that journey with the disciples of discovering who Jesus truly is. What we'll see, though, is time and time again, those on the margins, women, children, the possessed, the hurting, the blind, they seem to have an innate sense of who Jesus is almost immediately, whereas the disciples, the Pharisees, the religious authorities, they don't seem to get who Jesus is immediately. And so Mark seems to be playing with that theme of insider, outsider. Outsiders seem to get Jesus innately and intimately, and insiders seem to struggle a little bit more to understand who Jesus truly is. That's a great question. I'm glad you asked that. But as of through chapter 4, it seems that the disciples are still clueless.
Darryl, how do you define exorcist?
Oh, how do I, or how does the Gospels?
Yeah, I guess the gospel, I guess, is what.
Okay, so it seems to be that the Gospels have a very clear understanding that they, for the most part, differentiate between healing and exorcism. A healing is someone who has a physical malady that their life is restored to balance and wholeness. So if someone has a withered hand, the hand is healed. If someone has an eyesight infirmary, the eyesight is restored. So there seems to be physical healing, and then those who have, in the case of the Mark, in terms of demonic possession. And when we get to that story in the 5th chapter, I really want to have a conversation about this. So I want to kind of leave it there for right now, Janet. But an exorcism is a spiritual healing that has to do with removing the demonic presence to make the spirit whole again, which sometimes has a physical component to it, but doesn't always. But the gospels seem to differentiate between physical healing and exorcisms. But when we get to chapter 5, I want to dig into that a little bit more. So just hold on just a little bit more on that question. It's a good question though. All right, it's 8:07. Willow is bored and I need to eat. But I hope y'all have had fun through 4 weeks. I have had a great time through 4 weeks. Thank y'all so much for trusting me with guiding this Bible study. And until I see y'all again, be well and may God bless you and keep you.